Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Negar Okar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive Project. Before we begin tonight's session, I want to take a moment, especially with Thanksgiving just around the corner here in the United States, to share how truly grateful I am. First and foremost, I am deeply grateful to the Medici Archive Project for giving me the opportunity to be here to connect with our brilliant speakers and to connect with all of you every week. I am also profoundly grateful to you, our audience. Even though I can't see you, I feel your presence, and knowing that 70, 80, 90 people join us each week from every corner of this world fills me with immense joy and appreciation. As a member of the extended Medici Archive Project family, I would also like to express a heartfelt thank you to our friends, those of you who support us financially. Your generosity makes our programs like MAP Forum and so many other MAP initiatives possible. Your support allows us to continue pursuing our mission and creating opportunities like tonight's event. So thank you, everyone, from the bottom of my heart for being part of this community. And there is no better night than tonight, right before Thanksgiving, to gather together and reconnect with three of our wonderful fellows as we hear all about their fascinating research projects and get to know them a little more. So let's get started, and please join me in welcoming our three fellows, Rebecca Cappelli and Miguel Soto and Noah Margulis, who are here to present their projects. They all have been at MAP in Florence this year from March to April, June 2025, and they're going to share their findings tonight with us. So we're going to start with Miguel. I know that Rebecca had some technical difficulties joining tonight, so I'm going to give her a little time. So we're going to start with Miguel and proceed with Noah, and then we will conclude with Rebecca tonight. Miguel, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Miguel is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oxford, and he's joining us tonight from Oxford. He was at the Medici Archive Project from March to June 2025, as I mentioned, and the title of his talk is The Medici in the Atlantic Maghreb, the Sephardic Marchena Family in Tuscan Intercultural Diplomacy. Miguel, we can't wait to hear all about your project.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for being here. Today, I would like to present here the results of my research as a Beatrice Solomon Fellow at MAP, a project that traces the trajectory of the Sephardic Marchena family and their role in a transregional network connecting the Saadian Sultanate of Morocco with several European powers between 1574 and 1609. The Marchena family, who specialized in trading sugar from the Atlantic Maghreb to Europe, follow a classic Sephardic trajectory from Castile to Portugal in 1492, and from there into a wider dispersion that led different members to settle in Morocco, Italy, and finally Dubrovnik. Throughout this period in the Western Mediterranean, the family operated as a cohesive network that combined the sugar trade with another dimension, the diplomacy at the Saadian court, at a time of a growing European competition for control of navigation and global trading routes around the Strait of Gibraltar. My research reconstructs this trajectory for the first two generations and analyzes how, through the Marchena network, the Medici dynasty was able to project political and commercial influence in Morocco without relying on formal embassies. To pursue this project, it was essential to work in the archive of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Unlike other European states whose interest in early modern Morocco was intermittent and, of course, whose documentation is highly fragmented, the Medici sustained a continuous engagement with the Atlantic Maghreb between the 1570s until the beginning of the 17th century, closely tied to the development of Jewish Livorno. This process generated a corpus of several types of documentation that make it possible to follow the Marchena network in detail and to understand how cross-cultural contacts function alongside commerce. To meet these objectives, I focus my work on three main archives, which I present here in order of importance. First, the Archivio di Stato di Firenze, where the Mediceo del Principato and Carteggio Universale sections were essential, as they contain the state documentation related to the diplomatic activity promoted by the Medici. Safeconducts, correspondence, reports, and treaties directly involving the Marchena family. I complemented this with Pratica Secreta section for commercial privilege granted to the family, and of course with notarial records, which allow me to locate the Marchenas in contracts, loans, and partnerships in Pisa. Second, the Archivio di Stato di Pisa, especially the Consoli di Mare section, which was indispensable for tracing African goods traded by the family beyond sugar. And, of course, for reconstructing the Sephardic commercial networks connected to the Marchenas. And finally, the Archivio di Stato di Livorno, particularly the Governatore Auditore section, which preserves records on incoming goods and commercial disputes. Taken together, this collection traces the family's shift across its first two generations, from trade to diplomacy, in step with Medici interests and allow a level of reconstruction rarely possible for such diasporic network. The first generation consisted of 4 brothers distributed across 2 key spaces, the Saadian court of Marrakech and Fez, and the Tuscan port of Pisa. In Tuscany, Roderico and Diego de Marchena, the 2 first brothers, settled in 1574 in Pisa, not in Livorno, as New Christians under Medici protection. The same year, they received the monopoly on importing Moroccan sugar in exchange for teaching the Tuscan fleet the unknown route to Agadir in southern Morocco. From this year on, the Portati di Navío show a steady growth in traffic handled by the family, sugar, wogs, wheat, and medicinal plants, while Tuscany exported wool and textiles. In fact, by the 1590s, this increased maritime corridor was effectively controlled by the Marchenas and, of course, supported by the renewed Medici privilege. Meanwhile, the other 2 brothers settled at Moroccan courts and formed the necessary counterpart of the network, providing political influence. In Marrakech, Giovanni de Marchena became the central figure of the network. His close relationship with Sharif Hamad al-Mansur secured him a privileged position at court and control over the export of sugar from southern Morocco. In Fez, the second court of the Saadian Sultanate, his brother Fernando Pérez de Monte Albano, operating under a different surname, which was a common strategy among these families, integrated into Jewish elite such as Benzamero, Palace, and Ruti families, long-standing controllers of external trade and diplomatic mediation. Through these alliances, Giovanni and Fernando assumed similar roles at the Saadian courts. It was commercial and political intermediation between Morocco and Europe. And also, they began to insert themselves into the Spanish information networks in the region, as I show in this map. On this economic base, a political role emerged when, after 2 decades of continuous trade, the Marchenas had become the established channel to the Saadian court, and Flores' interest shifted from commerce to diplomacy. Over the 1590s, however, Giovanni's growing influence at Marrakech, which was precisely due to his shared businesses with the Saadian political elite, allowed him to defend Tuscan commercial interests directly before the Sharif. His command of Arabic, Hebrew, and Castilian made him indispensable in personal audience, where he delivered and translated ducal letters at a time when Castilian had become the main diplomatic language with early modern Morocco. These contacts were also reinforced through gift-giving. Alongside shipment of marble for the Badi Palace, nowadays disappear, Florentine records reveal an unrealized plan to send Arabic edition from the Tipografia Medicia, the Medici Arabic Press, to Morocco, an initiative advanced by the Marchena brothers. In fact, by the end of the 16th century, Giovanni was widely recognized as a trusted counselor of the Saadian ruler, occupying a position that blurred the line between merchant and political agent. At that point, the Medici had their interest well represented in Morocco and turned to a more ambitious goal, securing an Atlantic port, especially Larache, the most important Moroccan port in this area. A name, Larache, that was also shared by Spain, Venice, France, and years later, Netherlands. The competition for control of the Strait of Gibraltar offered the Marchenas unprecedented leverage. They could negotiate with multiple powers while maintaining loyalty to the Medici, who provide the most stable long-term patronage. In the 1590s, Giovanni de Marchena also became the main agent of the Spanish Marquis to obtain the port of Larache, of course, in exchange of commercial privileges in Andalusia, always presented as a good Christian to the Spanish authorities. Yet, this model was not only limited to the Spanish Marquis. A parallel branch took shape in Venice, where Rodrigo, one of the brothers who was in Pisa, moved to Venice in 1589 as an openly Jewish merchant and promoted a new Moroccan route for Venice. Although less successful than the Tuscan model, it illustrates the capacity of the network to duplicate itself in different political centers. And although they constitute case studies in their own right, they repeat the same functioning model and are subordinated to the main network in Tuscany. The second generation of the family did not simply inherit this configuration. They reoriented the network in response to different changes. On the one hand, they extended the family geographical reach. Alonso Núñez de Herrera, Rodrigo's sons, acted as a commercial agent in Cádiz, in southern Spain. Gonzalo Delgado, Giovanni's sons, settled in Lisbon as a new Christian, and Alonso de Marchena, Diego's sons, opened a branch in Rouen, France, and a second one in Hamburg, in Germany, that managed sugar export and military supplies bound for Castile. This shows how the family gradually linked its Maghreb core to wider Atlantic and Northern European systems. The peak of the Marchena's influence came in the early 17th century, when they secured a political agreement with the new Saadian Sharif, Moulay Sheikh, Ahmad al-Mansur's son. It advanced both commerce privilege and the proposed cession of Larache, an accord drafted in Castilian and negotiated in parallel to similar, though unsuccessful, initiative pursued by Spain and Venice. Negotiation continued between 1605 and 1609, as the brothers remained the central intermediaries when Medici priorities were turning from this area to other global theaters. And after 1603, the structure that had sustained the network began to collapse. The Saadian Civil War, which would last until the middle of the 17th century, repeated epidemic plagues common in North Africa, and finally the destruction of sugar mills in southern Morocco undermined both their political access and their economic base. Jewish quarters in Fez and Marrakech suffered in this period repeated attacks, forcing the Marchena family to rethink its strategy. So the Marchena reduced their direct presence in Morocco and moved to Dubrovnik, where they integrated into Ottoman trade through Balkan routes. At those moments, the family gravitated towards Amsterdam, where, by the 1620s, they completed their public return to Judaism and assumed a very important role in the intellectual life of Jewish Amsterdam in 17th century. Taken together, this development showed a shift from a network centered on the Saadian court and Tuscany to a very different configuration anchored in Atlantic and Northern European spaces, abandoning the diplomatic sphere with Muslim authorities which had characterized the previous family's trajectory. As conclusion, the Marchena case demonstrates how a small Sephardic family built a transregional network capable of operating simultaneously in multiple political spheres. Their distinctiveness lay in their strategic use of multiple cultural identities and in the political capital that Giovanni de Marchena accumulated at the Saadian court for more than 30 years. This combination allowed them to negotiate with European powers, secure commercial privilege in multiple states, and, at times, deliberately mislead different authorities to favor the Medici above their other patrons. Their collaboration with the Medici rebels that Tuscany developed an early Atlantic strategy which depended on merchants, go-betweens, and informal agents, especially after the failure of its formal diplomacy in Istanbul in the 1570s. In doing so, their trajectory anticipates patterns later associated with families such as the Palace. Yet, the Marchena remains unique for their early and sustained specialization in a region not yet integrated by other Sephardic networks at that moment. Finally, this project has focused on the family's diplomatic role and their service to the family, which I plan on publishing soon as an article. But much work remains to be done, recovering the full scale of their commercial networks, analyzing their role within Jewish communities, and reassessing their transformation in Dubrovnik and finally in the Dutch Republic. In any case, I would like to express my gratitude to the Medici Archive Project for the trust placed in this project. Without this fellowship and without the continuous help and support that all the MAP team offer through my time in Florence, this research would not have begun and it could not have continued to grow in the way it has. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you, Miguel, for this wonderful presentation. I enjoyed your the materials that you showed, and of course the archival documents that you shared. Thank you. And our next fellow is Noah Margulis, who is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Fine Arts in New York, and he's joining us from New York today. The title of his presentation is The Renaissance Bookshelf, Print Collecting and Book Ownership in Early 16th Century Florence. Thank you so much, Noah, for being here today. And we can't wait to hear all about your research.
Thank you, Negar, for the introduction. Let me just share my screen. Oops. Yes, okay, great. So thank you, Negar. I also want to extend my thanks to the staff of the Medici Archive Project and its director, Alessio Asanitis, as well as to the Crest Foundation for their generous support of my research, and to the study of early modern art more broadly. I'll try to keep this presentation brief since I know it's late for some of the attendees and we are heading into a holiday weekend. But I thought I'd take this opportunity to introduce my dissertation project, which focuses on pictorial prints and printmaking in early 16th century Italy, especially in Rome, and outline the archival sources I consulted while in Florence this past winter, and the results, some preliminary findings from this research, including some minor discoveries, some unpublished inventories, which I'm still processing, and I would, of course, welcome comments, questions, and suggestions about this material. Right. So my dissertation, The Proof State of Art, Printmaking and the Graphic Arts in Rome, 1510 to 1550, examines the shifting role of prints over the course of 4 transformative decades in the history of Italian art. Through careful considerations of the printed outputs of Marcantonio Raimondi and his school, and the painters and sculptors Rosso Fiorentino, Baccio Bandinelli, and Parmigianino, my project assesses how these artists and their contemporaries related to and understood the relatively new medium of print. This study also demonstrates how the socio-political upheavals of the Italian wars stretched the possibilities of this portable medium, print. Many of the figures discussed in my dissertation were working in Rome in the years before the city was sacked by imperial troops in 1527, an event that resulted in the death but also the displacement of that city's artists. And so the story goes, the spread of the international style known as Mannerism. But despite sustained interest in this period of art history and its protagonists, its prints are generally treated as an area of separate or specialist inquiry. My project aims to better integrate this corpus of images into our understanding of early 16th century art and to reassess the role of prints, especially in artistic education, artistic communication, and workshop practices. In Italy, these decades witnessed dramatic changes in the content, format, and even techniques used to make pictorial prints. Classical figures, erotica, ornament, and crowded battle scenes predominated over religious images. Serial formats, illusionistic framing devices, signatures, and inscriptions all become built-in components of prints during the period covered by my dissertation, and this expanding parergon or framework of prints suggests an emerging concern with the ability of prints to be dispatched, sold, and collected, right, to enhance their social function in an emerging culture of collecting and discernment that prized artistic novelty. Of course, novelty was not always welcome. In 1506, while in Venice, Albert Dürer discovered that Marcantonio Raimondi had copied his woodcut series, The Life of the Virgin, in engraving, going so far as to include Dürer's monogram in the images. And Dürer complained to the Venetian authorities, arguing that Raimondi's copies deceived buyers and damaged his reputation. Around 2 decades later, around 1524, the painter Giulio Romano and the engraver Marcantonio Raimondi collaborated on a series of erotic prints known as I Modi. The publication caused a scandal in Rome. Pope Clement VII ordered the destruction of the copper plates and all copies of the printed edition, as well as the imprisonment of their engraver, Marcantonio. In both cases, Giorgio Vasari's account of these events remains the only documentary source, as no evidence from either the Venetian or Roman archives has been able to confirm these infamous cases. The absence of documentary evidence confirming these infamous disputes prompted me to look more closely at what kinds of records did exist for early print production in order to trace how printmaking was entangled with civic and legal authorities in its formative decades. So studies of the organization of print publishing and print selling are often hampered by this scarcity of archival documents. With the exception of Venice, the print trade in Italy operated largely without protections and controls for its first century. But the Archivio di Stato in Florence offered a few avenues of research into the structure of the administrative oversight of printmaking and print selling during this period, especially from the early to the mid-16th century. So I focused my admittedly unfocused search on the records of 2 civic administrative offices, one that dealt with printers directly, and the other with the deceased owners of printed materials. These sources allowed me to extrapolate some information about general attitudes towards print and book publishers, the precarious economics of the print trade, the average quantity of prints produced, and the ownership and storage of printed materials in Florentine households. So firstly, the records of the Auditori della Riformulazione contain copies of decisions rendered after applications were submitted to the ducal administration requesting printing permits and privileges which protected publishers from reprinted or competing editions produced and sold within Tuscany. The oldest or first privilege we extant against reprinting in Florence dates to 1558 and concerns a well-known edition of choral music collected by the Flemish composer Adrian Willaert. The privilege was granted to Willaert's collaborator, the Ferrarese composer and musician Francesco della Viola, who worked at the estate court alongside Willaert in the 1550s. So privileges typically prohibited the reprinting of specific works and the sale of reprinted editions in Tuscany for a period of 10 years. And I'm not showing any because they're Latin and pretty formulaic. And they usually specify that in the event of violation, the publisher of a reprinted work would have to pay a fine and their stock of reprinted works would be confiscated. Despite the lack of privileges issued expressly for images in these sources, the documents provide information on the decision-making processes of this government agency. And what becomes clear here is that by the mid-16th century, the commodity status of printed works was firmly established, right? And protection against piracy or financial loss was necessary. Several petitions to the court by publishers such as Filippo and Jacopo Giunti complain of financial problems, especially the high cost of typesetting and proofreading texts in Greek, Latin, and Italian, the small market for books in Tuscany compared to Venice and even Turin, and also the state of the Florentine economy and its high taxes. It seems that by the 1550s and 1560s, protection against piracy and financial loss was increasingly necessary. And this helps to explain Giorgio Vasari's decidedly negative views toward print expressed within the text of the Lives, the Vitae, where he writes that print publishers were motivated by profit above all else. Okay. Earlier documentation, however, reveals a very different stage in the development of Florentine print commerce before the system of print privileges emerged in Florence, when reprinting and reselling printed images and books was far more common. Possibly the most important document for the production and sale of printed images is the post-mortem inventory of the print seller Alessandro Rosselli. Alessandro had inherited the print shop and stock from his father, the more well-known Francesco Rosselli, a painter, illuminator, and printmaker, who was also the brother of Cosimo Rosselli, the famous painter of the Quattrocento. Alessandro died intestate in March 1525, leaving two children, Lorenzo and Nannina. As minors and orphans, their mother Alessandra had also died. They became wards of the state for 3 years, represented by another stationer, Giovan Domenico di Filippo Spadini. Iodoco del Badia published a partial transcription of the inventory in 1894 at the suggestion of Gaetano Milanesi, who first found the document. But 2 copies of the inventory with slight variations are bound in separate volumes in the records of the Magistrato dei Pupilli. This is a fondo containing hundreds of unusually detailed household inventories used to help administer the estates inherited by minors. So the document also outlines how the sale of jewelry and furniture in this house and eventually parts of the shop inventory will help the minors and their guardians to pay the rent and cover expenses and food before Lorenzo comes of age. As noted by subsequent scholars, the inventory is unusually thorough and detailed, as the shop inventory was drawn up by Spadini, a stationer, alongside Lorenzo. However, as the inventory makes clear, Rosselli's premises supported a variety of activities from modest printing and bookbinding jobs, the sale of prints produced in-house, as well as stocked from other publishers and dealers, as well as a large backlog of printed images and supplies inherited from his father. It may also have functioned as a kind of haberdashery and home goods shop. In this way, the shop inventory, or what emerges from the inventory, is the ad hoc character of print commerce at this early stage, when print production and commerce was a piecemeal, loosely organized endeavor. Perhaps this doesn't come as a surprise to those of you in the audience. Interesting here, too, is the common vocabulary of qualitative judgment applied to these prints. The quality of the image and its material condition sits along the same spectrum of valuation used to describe worn garments, cookware, and furniture. So you see phrases like buono e cattivi, or rotte e stracciate. But as we see in the transcription, the best prints are listed first. That's the part I'm showing you here, and were probably displayed at the front of the shop. Spadini's description of these 26 items are his most specific, indicating how many prints there are and whether they are colored or mounted on canvas. Roughly half of the front of store prints for sale are maps and city views, and it's possible to narrow some of these down and identify them, which I'm not doing here, but I have. The other half are albums or folders of miscellaneous prints, including 2 lots of engravings listed as after Raphael, indicating most likely that these are recently produced engravings by the school of Marcantonio Raimondi in Rome. Only one print in this list can be identified conclusively: the ambitious engraving of the Massacre of the Innocents designed by Baccio Bandinelli and engraved by Marco Dente da Ravenna. This is significant as it demonstrates the name brand appeal and also ambitious scale of this print made it noteworthy and potentially lucrative, right? Valued or priced at 1 lira, an impression of this print equaled the monthly wages of manual labor, and it's one of the more expensive items in the shop, or at least the ones that we have estimates for. Lastly, I want to point out that the volumes containing the Rosselli inventories are one of a series that has not been systematically consulted by historians of print culture and book production in Florence. Most notably, Christian Beck's survey of Florentine book ownership skips over the 1520s entirely. Beck's large-scale study involved the collection, examination, and transcription of some 582 inventories from the Magistrato dei Pupilli, and documents the 11,000 individual books or volumes mentioned therein, sometimes by name and sometimes by number. It is an imperfect study, and the statistical data he culls from these inventories is highly relative. When the study appeared in 1984, the historian Armando Verde supposedly halted work on another project in order to issue a critical appendix with amendments and corrections of Beck's transcriptions in a small publication from 1987. Nevertheless, more recent work on the ownership of printed work, such as the multi-volume project Ricabim, still relies on Beck's study. So perhaps another appendix is necessary, as the volumes pertaining to the 1520s, right, the final years of the Florentine Republic, include extensive household inventories, often with book lists and document indices of private libraries, some belonging possibly to ancillary members of the famous families of Florence. I've listed some of the more famous last names here that are found within these volumes. I have not located any mention of print albums in these, but I am working to transcribe them and compare them to Beck's sources. So closer study of these inventories while helpful, will likely raise some of the same questions and objections elicited by Beck's study. So I'm wary of the project. Was a book purchased, a book read? Did the owner listed purchase the book, inherit, or borrow it? And when did those transactions occur? Ultimately, these additional inventories remind us that archival research on early modern print culture, especially at this early stage, rarely yields a complete picture. Any attempt to reconstruct the Renaissance bookshelf must proceed as a provisional historical project, one that perhaps is truer to the inherent properties of print: flimsy, ephemeral, multiple, and mobile. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Noah. That was a fantastic presentation. I very much enjoyed this one as well, and it was perfect timed. Yeah, we will have a Q&A at the end. After Rebecca's presentation, we will have a Q&A for all three of you. So if anyone has any questions, they can write it in the Q&A box. Thank you again, Noah. Now we can head to the last presentation of today. Rebecca, are you able to turn on your camera and share your screen? Rebecca, I know you had some technical difficulties. I see your name, but I don't know if you are actually there.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
The connection. Yeah. The connection is awful because it worked really well this evening. So I'm very sorry for the lack of slides because the connection is terrible. So I think it's impossible to support also a presentation. I'm sorry about it. Thanks for the patience and for the kindness. I don't know what to do.
Okay, you can can you present without your slides?
Yeah, of course.
Can you give us an overview of your project and your findings?
Okay. My doctoral project examines the geopolitics of Western Mediterranean and during the 16th century, with particular attention to the function of small sovereignties and to the presence of women in positions of authority. My research focuses on an exemplary case, the regency of Elena Salviati Appiano in Piombino between 1545 and 1548, and the characteristics of the relationship with Cosimo I de Medici. The investigation I carried out during my fellowship at the Medici Archive Project formed the essential basis for reconstructing this context, enabling me to show how Elena emerges at the intersection of dynastic strategies, Mediterranean politics, and propagandistic discourses. Elena was born in August 1500 in Florence to Jacopo Salviati, ambassador, banker, and advisor to the Medici popes, and Lucrezia de Medici, eldest daughter of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Consequently, she was the sister of Cardinal Giovanni Salviati and Maria Salviati, and therefore the aunt of Cosimo I. In 1518, Elena married Pallavicino di Anton Maria Pallavicini, a nobleman who oversaw several fiefdoms between Emilia and Lombardy, with whom she had one daughter, Luisa. However, Pallavicino died prematurely in 1522, and once widowed, Elena was obliged to defend her daughter's dynastic rights because she had been designated sole heir by her father. This became a formative experience, and the young Elena developed at this stage a combative spirit. Furthermore, the marriages of her daughter Luisa, first to Gagnino Gonzaga di Sabbioneta and later to Sforza, Duke of Santa Fiora and grandson of Pope Paul III, further strengthened Elena's links to the major patrician families of northern and central Italy. Then, in 1524, as a part of a marriage strategy devised by Pope Clement VII, Elena wed Jacopo V Appiano d'Aragona, Lord of Piombino. She was his fourth wife, and by contrast, she proved to be extremely strong-willed. In 1532, after two sons who had died prematurely, she finally gave birth to the long-awaited heir, Jacopo Giuseppe, later known as Jacopo VI. The lordship of Piombino, which also included the island of Elba with its iron mines, was by the mid-16th century a vital strategic hub for Charles V. In fact, commercial and military routes connecting Spain, Genoa, and Naples all crossed this territory, which also provided access to Tuscany. However, Piombino's military and economic fragility exposed it to the threat of Barbary corsairs and to French ambition. The imperial intention to remove such vulnerable yet significant fiefdom from the Appiano family coincided with the expansionist plans of Cosimo I, who financed and supported the fortifications of Piombino with the explicit aim of securing the investiture of Piombino for himself. The death of Jacopo V in 1545 overturned all these expectations. In his will, together with a codicil added by Helena, the will of Jacopo V granted their wife the guardianship of the son and the full regency over the state. So the widow quickly began a long campaign to prevent the transfer of the state to her nephew, firmly rejecting the proposal by Charles V of an equivalent fief for herself and son. Yet, despite her determined resistance between May and July 1548, the state of Piombino was handed over to Cosimo I. My study on Elena's regency could never have taken shape without a systematic exploration of Florentine archives. These repositories contain the materials produced by Cosimo I's secretaries, envoys, and network of informants, and records from the lordship, then later Principality of Piombino. My experience at the Medici Archive Project proved decisive both from a methodological and scholarly perspective. Through discussions with historians, specialists, and researchers, and through the use of the MIA platform, I was able to cross-reference different sets of archival materials produced by distinct political actors. As I mentioned earlier, reconstructing the events surrounding Elena Salviati requires through examinations of numerous collections preserved at the State's Archives of Florence, and I'll illustrate only the most important ones. In the collection Medici del Principato, the section Carteggio Universale primarily gathers letters received by Cosimo I, his family, and his secretaries from Italian and European states. Many letters also originate from the state of Piombino, often concerning military matters. Within this corpus, there are letters written by the Appiano family and the Medici commissioners, governors, ministers, and leading men-at-arms active in the Appiano lordship or in neighboring territories. In addition to the Carteggio Universale, the section Minute, meaning the drafts of letters sent by Cosimo I and the Medici secretaries, were equally revealing in tracing Cosimo's political plans and his shrewd maneuvers. Furthermore, the sections within the Medici del Principato dedicated to relations with Italian and foreign states contain letters from ambassadors, cittadini residenti, and agents. These documents offer detailed accounts describing events, negotiations, and political plots, and they provide an extraordinarily rich repertoire concerning the Piombino affair. The Miscellanea Medicia is also an essential collection for understanding the position of the Appiano family, thanks to a considerable number of bundles relating to their affair. There are two parts in this section. On one side, the materials produced by the Duchy, later Grand Duchy of Tuscany, concerning the Piombino question. On the other, a vast corpus of papers reflecting the history of the Appiano family and their small lordship. It is here that one observes the contrast between the propagandistic image of Helena, the tan endiablada mujer, poco saneada y tan sospechosa, the regent di mala natura, and the evidence of her actions. We depict a fierce woman managing an unstable diplomatical moment. Additionally, the collection Cartes Sorziane offer crucial insights into Elena's private life. Alongside the work conducted in Florence, my research also continued in Pisa, especially the Archivio Salviati of the Scuola Normale proved valuable for studying Elena's relations with her brothers, her parents, and her daughter. So the archival materials allow us to reconstruct the fact that Elena in 1545 immediately sought to establish direct diplomatic relations with prominent imperial ministers, supplementing these contacts by forging alliances with many Italian princes. In addition to this, she obtained financial and political assistance from Lucca, Siena, and especially from the Republic of Genoa. But when these attempts proved insufficient to halt the exchange, Elena started to negotiate with Pope Paul III and engaged in discussions with the King of France. The documents portray a regent active on multiple fronts. On the one hand, Elena tried to gain time. She accepted the imperial proposals for negotiation, but then cut provisions to the troops stationed in the Piombino fortresses. On the other hand, she skillfully exploited the internal divisions within the Habsburg court. Furthermore, episodes such as the resentment of her subjects over a rise in the salt tax and the corruption of her butler, tasked by the Florentines with generating tension between the regent and her son, illustrate how Piombino, with its citadel, was already a dangerous and internally divided place. For example, to protect her son from the concrete risk of kidnapping, Elena often hid them in the women's quarters of the court, or adopted the surprising soft power strategies, such as arranging marriages between the ladies of her entourage and Spanish soldiers, thereby securing informants within the opposing faction. A recurring theme in the correspondence is the question of the Appiano debts to Cosimo I and the imperial forces. When persuasion and threats failed, this vulnerability was exploited as political leverage against Helena. In 1547, Charles V ordered Don Diego de Mendoza to impose a national ultimatum on her, demanding 155,000 ducats within 20 days or the renunciation of the states. The regent responded as best as she could. She claimed she was capable of paying that amount and demonstrated that she had genuine financial support. In the same year, Cosimo's diplomatic pressure led to the occupation of the citadel of Piombino by Spanish troops. Elena refused to leave the fortress, forcing the soldiers to lift the chair on which she was sitting in order to remove her. The conflict, as I said, reached reached its peak between May and July 1548. Eleanor and her son were formally deprived of their fiefdom, but the transfer to Cosimo I was provisional. Elena did not abandon Piombino. She remained in the city, continued sending petitions to Charles V and to her allies, and steered the urban population against the new regime to generate pressure and turbulence. She sent her son to Genoa and later had him go to the imperial court so that he could advocate for their cause. Elena died in May 1551 in Piombino, but her death did not end the conflict, and it left her son with a clear political legacy to defend his dynastic rights and refuse any compensation. Jacopo VI married Vigilia di Erto-Refieschi, further reinforcing his ties to the Genoese aristocracy. Shortly after his mother's death, however, he reconciled with Cosimo I, eventually becoming general commissioner of the Tuscan galleys during the War of Siena. In 1557, thanks to the capitulation signed in London, the long conflict came to an end. Philip II recognized the reinstatement of the Appiano family in the lordship of Piombino, while Cosimo obtained the investitures of Siena and Porto Ferraio on the island of Elba. Despite the abundance and variety of the materials I examined, the most significant area of uncertainty concerns Elena Salviati Appiano's secret international network, particularly her relations with France, more generally with powers hostile or ambivalent towards Charles V. Medici and imperial sources contain many realistic accusations and attestations of this, but what is missing is the direct records confirming the extent of this context. So in order to complete the overall picture, and especially to address the gaps in the Florentine documentation, the next phase of research requires a systematic expansion of the archival base. The work I conducted during the fellowship at the MAP represents only the initial phase of a broader investigation that I'm developing in my doctoral research. The most urgent and necessary step is the research at the Archivio Generale de Simancas, which preserves the section essential for reconstructing the hegemonic plans of Charles V and Philip II. It contains letters and dispatches from imperial minister and preserves a body of correspondence by Elena and the Appiano family. The second major line of inquiry concerns Genoa, which was not only Elena's diplomatic ally, but also a remarkable protagonist in the entire affair. And the archives of Parma, Piacenza, Mantua, and Rome will also be indispensable. What emerges from the materials I've consulted is the decisive role of Elena, played by Elena in establishing the political direction that would ultimately lead to her son's restoration. Her actions, although exercised for a brief period, reveal her as a heir to a tradition of matronage embodied by both her mother Lucrezia de Medici and her sister Maria Salviati. And she appears as an actor in her own right, capable of negotiation and alliance building in a male-dominated environment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was great. I know how hard it is to just fit this whole project in just 15 minutes, and it goes by so fast. Okay, so by now the Q&A is open. If you have any questions, I would like to ask all our three panelists to turn on their videos for any possible questions from the audience. Thank you. Wonderful. All right. So I'm going to start with my own questions and then give some time to our audience in case they have any questions they want to write. So my first question is for Noah. Noah, you talked about these kind of the gaps and the ambiguous descriptions of Florentine inventories. So how do you think that all this like confusions and gaps, such as, for example, you said Roselli's shop or things like that, change the way we understand the how printed books and printed materials were made, sold, or even used in early modern Florence?
Thank you for that question. It's something I'm puzzled about because I think these things are valuable, but I think these gaps ultimately tell us that these things really weren't that valuable. If they were valuable, it was for the materials that were used in their production, that the actual text wasn't necessarily important in the context of the inventory. Perhaps that means, that I would need to go look at letters, describing. We have a lot of these by Pietro Aretino, for example, responding, or and Bembo as well, sort of responding to texts or directly. But I think the idea of looking to these for any clear direct evidence of attitudes towards prince is hard. It's unreliable.
Okay, thank you. We only have 4 minutes, and we do have a question in the Q&A by George Gorse. Hi, George. Thank you again for your generosity. So this question, thank you for these wonderful talks, Miguel. Does Genoa figure in this research? Miguel, this is for you. Does Genoa figure in this research?
Okay, for the moment, I have not planned to include Genoa because the importance of Genoa in relation with Morocco is do not start until the beginning of the 17th century. But, for example, I have the reference that one of the marble slabs I have mentioned in my presentation were bought in Genoa and sent as a gift to the Moroccan ruler.
Perfect, thank you. The next question is for Noah. Are there print dealers in early 16th century Florence print culture?
If they are print dealers, it's usually part of another job, right? Either they own a bookshop or a manuscript producing a shop, but that role of someone who focuses explicitly on printed images doesn't really exist at this time.
Great. Next question is for Rebecca. Have you consulted the Genoese Diplomatica in the Medici Archive and her interactions with Andrea Doria? You're on mute.
Not visited the archives in Genoa because I've just started my PhD in the city, so it will be certainly the major point staying there. Also, I read many letters from Andrea Doria to Cosimo and vice versa, so I can say that the relationships were apparently good, but in reality, in a certain point, many Genoese families like the Centurione and the Spinola supported Elena and her son, and so there was a moment of silent war, of Cold War between Genoa and Florence, because Genoa feared that Cosimo, becoming Lord of Piombino, would control the Tyrrhene. So it was a great man. It would be a great. It could be a great menace for the roots of Genoa.
Wonderful. And the next question is by Elizabeth Fama for you, Rebecca. Elena's daughter, Luigia, was the cousin who saved Cosimo from drowning in Venice as a young child. Did you come across all the correspondence you read that referenced this event at all?
No, I don't think they were so close, and I haven't read anything about this curious episodes. Of course, I know that Luisa was always or with her mother or her maternal grandparents, but I don't think that she was so close to Cosimo. She had two parallel life, and she was very close to Pope Paul III in a certain way. So.
Great, thank you. And the last one is a comment. Each presentation was so beautifully prepared, so beautifully presented, and so informative. Bravo and thank you, loved it. Thank you, Polly. Thank you to all of you for joining us from different parts of the world. It was truly a multicultural panel, and I truly enjoyed that. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to all our audience who joined from every corner of this world. And I would like to wish you all Thanksgiving, a great Thanksgiving if you are celebrating that, and hopefully we will see you again next week. Thanks, and have a good evening. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.